General Powell, what question should we start with?
If you don't know, I'm not going to tell you. You've got a great group here, and I'm sure you're going to have an excellent discussion. And I think Tony is uniquely qualified to deal with the issues of the day and to answer the questions that might arise. In an earlier session, Walter and I spent an hour and a half talking about these issues, but doing it in a way that's going to be for teenagers, kids, high school kids, which is where I spend most of my time with students now, because nothing I could do about my past, little I could do about the future except watch it, but there's a lot I can do about the real future, which is our youngsters coming along in a nation that's going to be increasingly minority. And we've got to prepare these minority kids for the leadership positions that will be waiting for them. And so that's kind of my passion, and I thank Walter for his support in this over the years, and I thank the Aspen Institute for what they do on a daily basis. And now ask a question, for God's sake. Don't just sit there. Bye, everybody. I got to run.
Thank you very much, General. It's my pleasure to introduce the Deputy Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who's been a great public servant and also a friend of the Aspen Institute. I know you're about to embark on a trip this coming week, so why don't you just open up by telling us what you're doing and what we should be knowing about.
Well, Walter, thank you very much, and it's great to be here with all of you. I have to say, following Secretary Powell even briefly makes me empathize with two people in particular, Alan and Rossi. They were the act that followed the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. So, with that said, I actually thought I'd spend a few minutes, and then we can get into the specifics, if that works for you, Walter, on some of the things we'll be doing next week, including going to Ukraine and visiting with our close European partners. Just sort of stepping back for a second and putting some of where we are in a little bit of perspective, because there are constant narratives out there about U.S. leadership or not, U.S. retreat from the world or not, and I think it's useful to create a little context for the discussions that we're about to have. I would maintain that never has the United States and its government been more engaged in more places than at this particular time. And if you look at what we've done in recent months and in recent years, mobilizing, quite literally, international coalitions and countries to deal with ISIL, to deal with Ebola, to deal with climate change, to deal with Ukraine and Afghanistan, you see that leadership in action. You saw it recently this summer when we brought the leaders of 50 African countries to Washington for the first African Leaders Summit here in Washington, connecting them with the private sector, putting in place a new foundation for moving forward on growth, on collective security, and building institutions. You saw it in Central America. The Vice President brought together countries of the Inter-American Development Bank to propose a new deal for Central America, where if their leaders stand up and take responsibility for dealing with problems of governance, of corruption, of security, we and like-minded countries in the region will support them. And you see it in Asia. I just got back from Japan, South Korea, and China, and you see it in an effort that's been ongoing for several years, that is the so-called rebalance, where we are in a very material and concrete way building institutions, strengthening our partnerships with existing allies, building new partnerships with new ones, opening up even further to trade through TPP, and building a more cooperative relationship with China even as we deal directly with our differences. And you're seeing it in places like Iran and Cuba. Think about this. The change that was made with Cuba, the possibility of an agreement with Iran, at least on the nuclear program, opens the prospect that in the space of about 9 months, two of the most difficult elements in the psychology of American foreign policy for the last decades will be in a new and different place. Doesn't solve the problems. We'll still have, if we do get a nuclear agreement, acute problems with the way Iran acts in the region and beyond, but quite significant. And the reason I say all this is, again, because there is this notion somehow that America is in retreat or is not leading. And again, I think nothing could be further from the truth. And maybe the best way to test the proposition is to think of what is probably a favorite movie among many people in this room, or at least one that you're subjected to just before Christmas every year, and that's It's a Wonderful Life, We know what happened to Bedford Falls when George Bailey was out of the picture. We know what would happen in each of these instances that I just talked about if the United States was out of the picture. Imagine where we would be for all of the deficiencies and challenges that remain. Where would we be without the United States in the campaign against ISIL? Where would we be when it comes to dealing with climate change? Where would we be on Ebola, on Ukraine, etc.? The fact of the matter is we are leading, so the question really should be, and the debate should center around, how are we leading? With what means, toward what ends? That is the proper subject for debate, and one that I'm very happy to engage.
Now, you were going to say that you're going next week to Europe mainly to deal with the Ukraine issue. Explain what that trip is about and what you're going to do.
Well, we have, the Secretary, of course, is in Europe now. He's working on Iran, but he's also working closely with our European partners on Ukraine. It is a very challenging situation, but let me put it in perspective, because I think there, too, it's important, then we can cover the specifics. There are a couple of big principles at stake in Ukraine, because you can make the argument that what happens in Ukraine doesn't go to our fundamental strategic interests. But I think when you look at the principles at stake, there really is a lot here that we need to be mindful of, and it explains why we've been so focused on this and why we've been leading the effort to put pressure on Russia to reverse what it has done in Ukraine. First, the notion that you can change the status quo by force, and in particular, a big country can do that to a small one, is not a precedent that we want to allow to stand in the beginning of the 21st century. And were that to happen, I think you'd see serious and very negative repercussions, not just in Europe, but in other parts of the world. Second, and this is something that doesn't get a lot of attention, when I served in the Clinton administration, one of the great achievements early on was making sure that the successor countries to the Soviet Union that inherited nuclear weapons, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, actually gave up those nuclear weapons. And in the case of Ukraine, the deal was this. They said, we'll give them up, but we want our sovereignty and territorial integrity guaranteed. And 3 countries signed on to those guarantees: the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia. Imagine what this says now if we allow Russia to, in effect, ignore and tear up that agreement. It's the so-called Budapest Memorandum that many of you are familiar with. What does it say to a country like North Korea that has nuclear weapons and we're trying to persuade to give them up? What does it say to a country like Iran that doesn't yet have nuclear weapons? We're trying to get Iran to forswear them. If the kind of assurances that countries with nuclear weapons may want to give them up are, in effect, ignored. So there are big things at stake here.
I was just reading Stroke Talbot's rereading Russia Hand, where he talks about negotiating that. And that Budapest Memorandum actually commits and obligates us to certain things. Will you explain what those obligations are?
Well, we made a commitment to stand with the 2 other countries, ironically, for several propositions, and critical among them were the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of Ukraine, and that has been grossly violated over the last year. So, where are we? I think there's a good news piece of this and a bad news piece of this. The good news piece is this: because of the pressure that we were able to exert, with President Obama leading throughout this process in working with the Europeans, getting them to exert the pressure with us, keeping the unity that was so necessary to making that pressure effective, we did create space for Ukraine to have 2 successful elections and produce probably the most effective government that it's had since it's been independent. We also created space for Ukraine to sign the association agreement with the European Union, which was part of the cause of the crisis in the first place. But what we haven't seen, unfortunately, is the separatist land grab fueled by Russia, supplied by Russia, organized in many cases by Russia. That has not stopped. There was a basis for stopping it in the Minsk agreements. The first ones concluded in September, and now an implementation plan that was agreed by the countries in question just a couple of weeks ago with Germany and France's leadership. And there's a clear way out there. If Russia makes good on the commitments it made in these Minsk agreements, there is what we call an off-ramp. And if Russia takes that off-ramp, the pressure that's been exerted, the sanctions that have been exerted, those can begin to be removed. You'll always have the Crimea problem, and that's significant, and that's not going away anytime soon, and the pressure won't go away there. But for the Eastern Oblasts, it could, and it should. Russia is paying a huge strategic cost for what President Putin has engaged it in Ukraine. We see the devastating impact on the economy taking deeper and deeper root. We've seen capital flight of a rather extraordinary proportion, more than $150 billion over the last year. We've seen a virtual standstill in foreign direct investment. We've seen the ruble at an all-time low, despite the fact that they've spent more than $100 billion in reserves to try and bail it out. We've seen the country get ratings of junk bond status from the major rating agencies. We've seen growth go from about 2.5% to 0. They're basically in a recession. And the drivers of the economy in the future have actually been singled out for the sanctions program, particularly the energy sector, where the technology Russia needs to actually take the next step in exploiting more difficult resources will be denied them. So this is not a good path. Also, it's worth pointing out that to the extent the Russians have gained Crimea and may now have this foothold in the eastern oblasts, they really have lost Ukraine. The country is now more united and more focused and Western-oriented than it's ever been in its history of independence. NATO is more energized than it's been in recent years. There is now a greater seriousness of purpose about energy security in Europe than we've seen in recent years. In other words, strategically, President Putin has precipitated virtually everything he sought to prevent. My concern is that he's been left with playing the nationalist card because there's not much else left to play. The combination of the sanctions, obviously the fall in oil prices, mismanagement of the economy, all of those things don't give him a strong economic hand to play. So you play the nationalist card, and it works in the short term. You see that in his numbers. The problem with the nationalist card is you have to keep playing it, because as soon as you stop playing it, then people start to focus on all the things that are going wrong. And that's why we tried, and we continue to try, to propose an off-ramp that allows him to move away from the direction that this is going. Right now, the critical thing is to see the obligations and commitments made in Minsk, both in September and then the implementation plan that was reached a week or so ago. Those commitments need to be implemented. There needs to be a ceasefire. The heavy weapons need to be pulled back. Ukraine has certain obligations too in terms of moving forward on decentralization legislation. And then critically, the international border has to be restored between Russia and Ukraine, because absent that border, it's basically Russia has a free hand to throw in equipment.
And if that doesn't happen, do we arm the Ukrainians?
So this is something that has been on the table and remains on the table as a possible course of action. Let me say a couple of things. First, we provided over the last 9 months or so about $120, $130 million worth of security assistance. And it's not just the infamous meals ready to eat. And by the way, meals ready to eat are kind of important, because if your soldiers aren't eating, they're probably not going to be able to do a good job. But beyond that, we've had counter-mortar radars that have been very important, night vision goggles, Kevlar vests, etc. We don't think that this conflict is going to be solved militarily. And the hard part about thinking about lethal assistance, even defensive, to the Ukrainians is that you do that and the Russians are likely to match it and top it and double it and triple it. So where does that lead? On the other hand, there's obviously a compelling case to be made for helping the Ukrainians defend themselves against aggression, and that's what we've been doing, and that's why the question of additional defensive assistance remains very much on the table.
Mm-hmm. Let me move to Iran. We're going to do that, and then I'm going to open it up because everybody here, I'm sure, has questions. The Secretary Kerry has been in Geneva this weekend, and he seems now to be getting closer, and I think has even told people at the State Department, prepare in case there is an agreement, how we're going to sell it, what we're going to do with Congress. Can you give me the outlines of what you think that agreement could be?
So where we are, first of all, is we've done a lot of hard work, and the Secretary's done extraordinary work in trying to get the elements of an agreement in place. We're not there yet. Whether we'll get there as we sit here today, I can't tell you. We are making progress, serious discussions, hard discussions, and moving, but we're not yet there. But at the heart, any agreement has to do a couple of things, and this is what it should be judged on if we get there. The most critical thing is, as a practical matter, it has to cut off Iran's pathways to fissile material for a nuclear weapon. So what does that mean? It means that they have potentially a pathway through their facilities that are uranium-based at Natanz, which is the one that has most things more or less on the surface, and Fordow. And that, as a practical matter, needs to be cut off. They have a plutonium program at the Iraq reactor. That, too, needs to be cut off. And then the fourth pathway to a bomb, that is a covert program, needs to be dealt with principally through transparency, inspections, access, so that we have confidence that they won't be able to pursue that. Now, what we've been looking at, and the measure that we've set is, we want to make sure that on all of these pathways, we have confidence that were Iran to break out of them, that is, decide to renege on its commitments or cheat, that it would take at least a year for Iran to produce enough fissile material for one nuclear weapon.
Did Israel initially agree to that framework?
There is a, look, I think from the Israeli perspective and from everyone's perspective, if we could achieve zero enrichment in Iran, that would be great. So I think if you ask the Israelis, I suspect they continue to say that that would be their objective. But the fact is, Iran has mastered the fuel cycle. We can't sanction that away. We can't bomb that away. We can't argue that away. And most of our partners, I think, have accepted that proposition. The question is not whether or not they should have.
So you say most of our partners, does that include Israel?
Well, I'm talking about the ones who are negotiating with us. That is in this group, in the P5+1. The question is whether you can design a program that is so constrained, so limited, so checked, so monitored, that you have confidence that they will not be able to produce fissile material for a weapon, should they choose to do so, in less than a year, which gives you, if that were to take place, plenty of time to do something about it. Keep in mind two other things, and this is important. It's not just the fissile material. You actually need a weapon. And our experts believe that while they were pursuing a weaponization program till about 2003, that was put on, that was halted. You also need a way to deliver the weapon, and that goes to the missile program. And then even if you got all of that, when it comes to fissile material, the idea that most countries would actually break out for one weapon's worth of material is pretty unlikely. So we've been very, very conservative about this. And if we're able to achieve that, then I think we would be confident in moving forward. The other thing that's important is this. In any of these situations, you always have to ask, as compared to what? So if there's no agreement, what happens? Well, a lot depends on why there's no agreement. If we're seen as being the recalcitrant party, that's going to make it very difficult to sustain the sanctions coalition that we've spent so much time building up. Congress put in place very strong sanctions, has done a very good job on that. But the sanctions are much less effective if other countries don't join in implementing them and enforcing them. And this president has spent enormous time building and strengthening that coalition. If that starts to go away, the pressure's off and it moves in a bad direction. The other alternative, of course, is potentially military action. And I think it's clear that one could certainly set back the program for some period of time, and that if it comes to that someday. But you're also probably looking at setting it back, not stopping it, because again, the Iranians have the knowledge. They'll build it back up, and it will probably be driven underground. So that's not an ideal solution. And of course, with military action, there tend to be unintended consequences that are something
How
we prefer to avoid.
important is it in such a deal that the Iranians come clean about what they were doing, and the international agencies where they've not exactly come clean?
Yeah, so the IAEA has been, as many of you know, engaged with the Iranians to try to do just that, to get transparency on what has taken place, what they were trying to do in the past. And that is important. And I think...
So would that be part of a deal, you think?
It's technically separate from the deal in the sense that there's a separate dialogue going on with the IAEA, but we would like to see satisfaction of that. I think...
I'm sorry, so you're linking those two now.
So it's important for the IAEA and Iran to come to conclusions about the so-called possible military dimensions of the program. The most important thing, though, is, when you think about this, is going forward. That is, putting in place the regime that we need and that our partners need to give us the greatest possible assurances that Iran is making good on its commitments, not deviating from them, and not cheating on them. And that goes to what kind of inspection regime you have, what kind of transparency. And what has to result from any agreement is the strongest, most intrusive inspection and access program that any country has seen, because Iran has forfeited the trust of the international community.
And you think you'll be able to get an intrusive inspection?
That will be a test. That will be a test of any agreement. And I think what we've seen already in the interim agreement is much greater access than the international inspectors have had before, and in places that they didn't have it before. What's interesting, among other things about it, is they've had access along different points of the production chain for fissile materials. So, for example, the mines and mills, not just the places where the centrifuges are spinning. The more you have of that, the greater the certainty you can have that Iran is making good on its commitments.
How do you respond to Netanyahu's comment that it was, quote, astonishing that you were going forward without having resolved the coming clean issue?
Well, again, that's an ongoing process. The IEA has been engaged in it. They've made some progress, and they've also had a lot of frustration with Iran not coming fully clean. That's something we want to see move forward over the coming months. And I think, keep in mind, even if there is an agreement, the actual relief that would come to Iran in terms of initially the suspension of sanctions and then ultimately the lifting, the repeal of sanctions, they will have to make good on their commitments up front. And I think one of the things we would expect to see is some resolution of the issues with the IEA.
Do you think it's problematic that Netanyahu's coming to speak to Congress?
So let me say a couple of things about that. First, Prime Minister of Israel is always welcome in the United States to speak any place, anytime. I think what's unfortunate here is the way this came about. And because of the way it came about, it turned it into a political issue, and the relationship with Israel should not be a partisan or political issue. The fact of the matter is, over the course of the last 6 years, when it comes to Israel's security, in my judgment, no administration has done more than this administration. And the relationships at every level, whether it's among the political leaders, the intelligence officials, the defense officials, I don't think there's been more coordination, cooperation, dialogue, exchange than we've seen in the last 6 years ever before. And where it really matters, the provision of what Israel needs to defend itself and protect itself, this has been an exceptional period. Let me give you one quick example. This is something that I happen to see up close and personal. This past summer, during the Gaza crisis, I was in my office at the White House at the time, and I got a call from Israel's ambassador, Ron Dermer. He says, "I'd like to come see you on an urgent basis." Of course, came over at about 8:30 at night, and he said, "We really need an urgent resupply and funding to buy more interceptors for Iron Dome, the missile defense system that has saved many, many lives." And he and the defense attaché ran through the substance of why they needed it and why they needed it then and there. The very next morning, this was on a Thursday night, Friday morning, I was in the Oval Office with the president, and I ran through what I had heard from the Israelis, and he said, "Make it happen." And by Tuesday, we had $250 million from Congress to do that. So whatever the tensions, whatever the disagreements on various issues, when it comes to the core of the relationship, that is our absolute commitment to Israel's security, it's never been stronger.
If you get a deal that you feel is good and the rest of our negotiating partners feel is good, to what extent do you think you need Congress's approval, and for what aspects do you or do you not need Congress's approval?
Congress is an absolutely integral part of this entire process, from takeoff to flight to landing. The sanctions regime that Congress legislated, and then the international component that we helped bring to bear, without that, Iran would not be at the table. It's as simple as that. So Congress was absolutely critical in even getting us to the point that we're at. Going forward, Congress is going to be critical because, as I said, what we're looking at doing, if we get an agreement, is initially suspending sanctions, which the president can do under his own authority, but then ultimately ending them. And Congress has to do that. And the reason we do it this way, or we propose to do it this way, is that having the sanctions suspended creates real leverage to make sure that Iran makes good on its commitments. As soon as you end them, that may take some of the
So
incentive
in other
away.
words, you're not going to go to Congress to ask that the sanctions be ended right away?
Not right away. What we want to see, if we get an agreement, is Iran demonstrating that it's making good on the commitments. And then Congress has a very strong role to play in insisting on that, and then not actually ending as opposed to suspending sanctions until Iran has demonstrated that it is making good.
David?
Thanks very much, and good to see you, Tony. One more question on Iran while we're still on this. Many people in Congress who I've spoken with seem surprised that at the end of this agreement, whenever this agreement ends, the Iranians are basically free to do what any other signatory to the International Atomic Energy Agency's treaties and so forth would be free. So they could go back and build the number of centrifuges in the tens of thousands that the Supreme Leader has discussed. Tell us what we're supposed to think about that. That's a big Israeli concern. It's a big concern in Congress. And also tell us how this concept of a phased agreement in which the Iranians would be frozen for 10 years and then may be able to build up slowly might work to alleviate those concerns.
So, without getting into any of the details of the negotiations, because keep in mind what's so challenging about these is that it really is the classic example of nothing's agreed till everything's agreed. And because of these elements are so interrelated, sometimes you hear one thing comes out in the media, and allegedly something we're proposing to do. And absent the context, it's often misunderstood. Let me give you one quick example of that, and then I'll answer the question directly. There's a lot of back and forth sometimes in the media about how many centrifuges might Iran have at the end of this process, and you see different numbers. And the reason that is going to be a subject of negotiation, and the reason that that number in the abstract is meaningless, is because if you're looking at ensuring that Iran, it must take at least a year for it to produce enough fissile material for a weapon. The number of centrifuges is an important component of figuring that out. But so is the type of centrifuge, so is the configuration of the centrifuges, so is the stockpile of material that they're allowed to work with. And depending on the configuration of those elements, you could have more centrifuges or fewer centrifuges and still get to your 1 year. So that's why looking at some of these elements in isolation is really the wrong way to go. With regard to the end of the process, that is, let's say there's an agreement and it lasts for years in the double digits, what happens at the end? And the fact is this: there will be a permanent ban on Iran pursuing weapons activity. It will have to apply the additional protocol in perpetuity. There will be extensive IAEA safeguards that are very significant, and during the process and during the agreement itself, for however long it lasts, what we will be learning about the program, every person involved, virtually, if not every nook and cranny, that base of knowledge will exist beyond the duration of the agreement. And then, of course, we would retain the same capacity and probably a greater capacity we have now to deal with any efforts by Iran to actually go to some kind of nuclear weapon. The Bush administration put on the table the proposition that Iran would be treated as a non-nuclear weapon state after it complied for some period of time with any agreement. And that's exactly what we're doing. That is the purpose of this very, very challenging exercise. At some point in the future, having demonstrated that it's making good on its commitments, Iran would be treated as a non-nuclear weapon state. But it is going to have we're going to have a knowledge of what's going on that far exceeds what we have now. And again, there'll be a permanent ban on weapons, and if we see it moving in that direction, we would be able to do something about it. We will have the same capacity we have today, and probably a greater capacity to act on it than we in however long it is for the duration of the agreement.
Given the point you just made about having to see the agreement as a whole to get to the 1 year breakout period, have the selective leaks been very problematic, and have they come from Israel?
I think that selective leaks on anything create more confusion than daylight, and that's unfortunate. One of the challenges of this business is that, and I know David appreciates this, is that we in government are constantly trying to plug the leaks, and our friends like David are constantly trying to pry them out. I think that the challenge is whenever there is a leak, whether it's on the Iran negotiations or anything else, one of the obligations that those writing about them have, I think, is to give it if possible, the context and the explanation so things are not seen in isolation.
Speaking of Davids who get leaks, David Ignatius? We'll go to the Goliaths after this.
I'll happily answer to that summons. Tony, let me ask you about two issues that will arise if you do get an agreement. And the first is the, I would say, likely demand of other countries in the region that they be allowed to have the same nuclear capability, threshold capability with enrichment, centrifuges, etc., that the agreement will grant Iran. And how do you envision dealing with that problem, proliferation? And second, the day after the agreement is the day before, Iran's threat to regional security through its proxies, through its foreign policy from Yemen to Damascus to Beirut to Baghdad is going to be there. How does the administration envision dealing with that problem in a world where you have an agreement?
Great, thanks, David. So with regard to whether other countries may see this as a model to follow, I think it's about the last model any other country would want to follow, because what is the Iranian model? It is a decade or more of sanctions, of isolation, of economic decline as a result of its efforts to pursue enrichment and reprocessing programs. And our policy remains that countries that don't have that technology ideally should not have it. The other thing that I think makes Iran no role model for anyone is that, as I noted, any agreement is going to have an exceptionally intrusive access, inspections, monitoring regime. And I doubt strongly that other countries in the region or elsewhere would want to have what Iran is going to have to accept if there's going to be any agreement. So I really don't see it as a model that anyone would want to follow. With regard to threats to regional security, you're exactly right, and I want to make it very clear that even as we pursued this agreement with Iran on the nuclear program, we have worked very, very vigorously to push back and counter and enforce the various sanctions and mechanisms that are out there to deal with Iran's actions and behaviors that are profoundly objectionable, whether it is support for terrorism, whether it is destabilizing activities in other countries that threaten some of our partners and allies, or indeed, for that matter, its own activities at home. And so what you've seen throughout this effort is the very vigorous enforcement of sanctions, including in the nuclear area, which we made very clear we would continue to strongly enforce all of the existing sanctions, and we have, but also in the terrorism area, in the issue of destabilizing other countries. We have, over the course of the interim agreement, designated, sanctioned more than 100 entities and individuals in all of those different areas. We've interdicted shipments to various countries that have been problematic. We've continued to vigorously enforce and monitor all of the anti-proliferation requirements. And we've also worked over the last 6.5 years to build up the capacity of our partners in the Gulf to deal with Iranian aggression and destabilizing activities. We work very closely with the GCC. We put in place different capabilities that strengthen their ability to deal with problems. We are working with the GCC as an entity. In fact, one of the things that we did is in terms of arms, the supply of arms and weapons, they can be treated as an entity for the purpose of acquiring arms from the United States. So all of that will continue as long as the activities that Iran is pursuing continues. But let me just add two things without exaggerating them. First of all, inherently, the biggest threat to stability in the region would be Iran armed with a nuclear weapon. And so to the extent the agreement takes that off the table, that is profoundly in the interest not only of the United States, but also of countries in the region. Second, I think that there are some elements in Iran that are trying to approach their policies around the world in a somewhat more pragmatic fashion, not because they are necessarily good guys or like us, but because they see it as in Iran's interest. And to the extent that those people emerge in a stronger position, and those who are pursuing the most noxious policies around the world are in a different position, that wouldn't be a bad thing either. But again, that's not a big aspect of this, but at least it's something to consider.
You just said something that caught my ear, which is that you're allowing the GCC to acquire weapons directly. Do you think that should or could lead to a path where some Arab nations create their own NATO, as General Sisi in Egypt and the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others may have talked about? And should that be something we encourage?
We hear more and more from our partners an interest in doing something like that. And so you're hearing from the Jordanians, you're hearing from the Saudis, you're hearing from the Emirates, you're hearing from the Egyptians, different ideas in that direction. Moving from talking about it to acting on it is, of course, a big challenge. But as a general proposition, their ability to come together and act in a unified way to deal with challenges would be a good thing. Now, we're seeing some of that in the context of the anti-ISIL coalition, where these countries are flying with us and flying together, and that's helpful. But I think seeing this kind of initiative coming out of the region, coming from these countries, is important. And now the question is whether they can move from thinking about it and talking about it to starting to put in place some practical elements.
P.J. Crowley?
Hey, Tony. On picking up on ISIL, you and the Vice President have spent probably as much time focused on Iraq as anybody else in the administration over the past 6 years. How do you assess the performance of the Abadi government so far? They seem to be saying the right things, but on the ground, do you see a change as of yet in the relationship between the Baghdad government and the Sunni community? And then secondly, on Libya, given the Egyptian action in the aftermath of the beheading of the Coptic Christians, should we view Libya now as a third front in the campaign against ISIL?
Great. Thanks, PJ. I think the Abadi government has taken significant strides to try and improve the relationship with the Sunni community and create buy-in so that that community sees its future not with ISIL but with Iraq. It's a work in progress. It's usually challenging, and I think they're in the middle of it, not at the end of it. But specifically, we saw the formation of a more inclusive government. We saw the naming, after this had been on ice for a long time, of a Sunni defense minister. We saw the Prime Minister take important steps, for example, disbanding the Office of the Commander-in-Chief, which had been Prime Minister Maliki's way of having control over the military outside the chain of command. That was disbanded. Dozens of generals were dismissed, were either ineffective or had very sectarian agendas. We've seen legislation that had been stalled start to move, including on de-Baathification. The Council of Ministers sent it back to the Council of Representatives a couple of weeks ago. There's back and forth there. And then very significantly, legislation to form a National Guard that would allow members of Sunni tribes to be part of a security force defending their own communities, but attached to the state through training and equipping and salaries. That legislation is probably going to take time, but in the interim, the Abadi administration agreed that it would try to train and pay for and integrate with the Iraqi security forces tribal fighters. And they made a commitment to do that with about 7,500, primarily in Anbar, and Nineveh, and they've reached that number. So on all of those fronts, we're seeing progress. We also saw a budget that was passed that provides significant resources for the Sunni governorates. On the other hand, one of the big challenges has been that as the Iraqi security forces in some places have moved to take back territory lost to ISIL, in the early going, the Shiite militia were a critical component of their success. And a number of those militia have been responsible for abuses and for revenge on the Sunni community that had nothing to do with ISIL. They were victimized by it. That's something that needs to be reined in a very serious manner. What's interesting has been that leaders in the Shia community, especially the Grand Ayatollah Sistani, have very publicly pushed back on the abuses of the Shia militia. So I would say it's a work in progress, but what's critical is in taking back the territory lost to ISIL, the integration of the tribal fighters with the Iraqi security forces. We're intimately involved in that. We're putting them together at the Al-Assad base where we have trainers. As that moves forward, then I think you'll see that Abadi's making real progress in actually showing the Sunni community that the future is with Iraq and not with ISIL.
James, Jim Man?
And Libya. Oh, Libya. So Libya presents a real challenge because it, to the extent that it becomes mired in civil war and truly chaotic, then it becomes a natural area that extremists will look to for a haven, because they prey on places that have weak governments, weak security forces, and are in conflict. So we have a very strong incentive to try and prevent that from happening. Right now, there's a significant effort underway, led by the United Nations, to try and form a national unity government. And the only good thing that's emerged from the recent atrocities in Libya conducted by ISIL or its affiliates is it seems to have at least marginally concentrated the minds of all of the different actors that there's something even more dangerous at stake than the differences that they have, and that is the potential for ISIL and affiliated groups to get a real strong foothold in Libya. So that may help get us to a unity government. If that happens, then the international community is in a much better place to be able to provide the kind of assistance that Libya so needs, and that can sort of start to build the bulwark against extremists taking root in Libya.
Tony, I wanted to switch continents for a second and ask about Asia, because you were just out there. I'm going to take a wild stab and guess that the subject of China might have come up with our allies. And I want to ask about sort of two related debates. One is how all-powerful is Xi Jinping now? Is there anything left of collective leadership in China? And the other is a narrative I see taking shape that really things went politically sour in China after Xi arrived in power, versus other views that really what we see now, as far as fairly tight repression, began in either in '99 or going way back, maybe 1989. But where do you see him now?
Look, I think it would be hard for me or for anyone else to really decipher exactly what is going on internally in China in terms of the sort of internal power politics of it. But it does seem, as a sort of outside observer, that the president has worked hard to consolidate his authority and his power, and has had some success in doing that. What I can talk about really is the state of the relationship and what we're trying to do together. And I think what we've seen, especially over the last year or so, is we've expanded the foundation for cooperation, and we're working together in more places productively than we have, I think, at any time in the past. And so just at the end of the year, as you know and saw, the leadership that we were able to exert with China on climate change was significant. China's efforts to deal with Ebola, in part at our urging, were significant. And beyond that, the military-to-military relationship is in a better place than it's been as a result of efforts at exchanges, confidence-building measures, et cetera. And going forward into this year, with the state visit of President Xi and a pretty active agenda we have, I think, the ability to continue to expand and deepen some of that cooperation. At the same time, part of this relationship is being very direct and very forthright about our differences and not trying to sidestep them or ignore them. And that's exactly the nature of the conversations that I had when I was out there, and obviously others have had, and the Secretary of State, the President, et cetera. But I think when I step back, I guess I think about two things. When I try to imagine how China should be looking at this or might want to think about looking at this. And I had these conversations with some of our counterparts. First, one of the primary sources of friction, as you know, Jim, better than anyone in the region, are China's maritime activities in the South China Seas, the Senkakus, et cetera. And this has caused a number of countries to come looking to us in ways that they haven't in the past. And one of the things I suggested to counterparts in China in some of our meetings is that, our countries are obviously very different systems, different evolutions, et cetera. And that this was a little simplistic, but it was nonetheless, I thought, relevant. And that is, in many ways, China now, at least in the region, is where the United States was after World War II. Then, our leaders had to decide how they would use our emerging power on the world scene. And they made incredibly wise decisions to take the lead in creating institutions, writing rules, establishing norms that bound us. And so on one level, restrained the full exercise of our power, but at the same time had the incredible beneficial effect of telling other countries, oh, you don't have to band together against the United States to check its power, because you have a voice, you have a say, you have the ability to help lead the direction of the world. And I suggested to some of our colleagues in China that this was relevant and interesting history as they thought about their approach to their emerging power. The other thing I'd say is this. When you think about the wealth of a nation today, in the past we defined it classically: how many people do you have? How big is your land mass? What's the size of your military? What's the abundance of your natural resources? And all of those things are critically important, and the good news for the United States is we're doing very well. Our wealth is great in all those areas. But I think there is a very strong consensus that in the 21st century, the true wealth of a nation is measured by its human resource and the ability of a country to maximize that resource, to allow it to debate, to create, to innovate, to think for itself. And there, we also have, I think, a position of great prominence and privilege in the world, and it's something, too, that our Chinese friends might want to reflect about.
Kimberly Dozier, and maybe you can get Congressman Berman's microphone and move up a little bit. Thanks. Press the red button, yeah.
Two-part question on countering violent extremism. First of all, how do you keep the pressure on? And second of all, how do you deal with the fight over what to call the militants? On CVE, a number of people I spoke to who attended the meetings this past week said, great ideas, but the same ideas as before, and the moment the attention is gone, there's not enough money, there's not enough consistency. And in terms of calling them Islamic militants versus criminal extremists, which are your Arab partners that ask you to call them criminal extremists instead of the other? And how do you keep the Republican comments about this from destroying your neutrality?
So I got to say, I sat through a big part of the meeting last week and then read the parts that I wasn't able to stay for, and I learned a tremendous amount from listening to people who'd been confronting this problem in different places and different aspects of the problem around the world. And just for that reason alone, I thought it was an incredibly valuable exercise. But it also builds, I think, solidarity and a common plan of action going forward. So let me just say a couple of things quickly, and I'll get to the specific questions. First, one of the questions we grapple with is, why do we see this? Why is this happening? And particularly, you've seen a significant expansion in the number of foreign fighters, people who travel from one country to another to get into the fight or to conduct acts of terrorism, more accurately. And one of the things that was striking, I think, in listening to this is that there's actually no one story. When you talk to the experts who have had a chance to talk to people who've gone from one country to another to join extremist groups, it's an incredible mix. Some are pious, some are not. Some are troubled, some are incredibly well adjusted and would do very well in their societies if they stayed put. Some seem to have a humanitarian calling because they believe some of the false stories that are told to them. Others are attracted by the notion of adventure and thrill-seeking. And then some, of course, actually are committed to this sort of totalitarian vision that ISIL and other groups have. So one of the first challenges is actually, at least this is one of the things that I picked up, is that there's actually no one story, which makes it even more complicated to deal with. If there was one driving reason or one clear explanation for why people engaged in these activities, it would be a lot easier to deal with. Now, there are some common denominators that did come out. One of the driving things is a perception among some that somehow Islam is under threat. And again, this is a perverted narrative that is foisted on them, but that's one of the elements that seems to come out. Another element that seems to be something of a common denominator is individuals who feel like they have no stake in the societies that they're in and no future. That too can be a driver. A lack of critical thinking skills is a common denominator in the studies that have been done. And then, of course, in the countries in question themselves, state repression, corruption, et cetera, are all drivers. And of course, for those of us who are dealing with foreign fighters who are coming back, some of these folks are coming back disillusioned because the stories they were told by ISIL or other groups turned out not to be true, and hopefully they can actually be reintegrated. Others are going to come back deeply troubled psychologically. They have to be helped. But then you're going to have a very dangerous core who come back with experience, with skills, further radicalized, who are going to try and make trouble at home, and they have to be dealt with very, very directly. So what do you do about all of this? I think there are two components, at least in what we've been trying to do. And this will get to, this is a long way of answering the question. First, we have to directly counter those who would use violence and terrorism. These are people who are beyond the reach of reason, and we go at them with everything we have. And that's why what we've done in the case of ISIL is build a strong military and counterterrorism component. We're working with other countries to cut off financing. We're working with other countries to stop or slow the spread of foreign fighters and the flow of foreign fighters. And we need to work on the message, the narrative, to get at the appeal. Homeland security, borders, all of that. Vitally important, and we're pouring a tremendous amount of energy and resources into that, but it has to be done in collaboration with others. But then, I think equally important, and it is not an either or, it is not choose one or the other, prevention is hugely important too. We want to try and counter the appeal so that those who are susceptible to signing up are fewer in number. And there, I think it's interesting, some of the things we heard last week, what are some of the tools in doing this? One of the most interesting things that jumps out at me was one word, parents, when you're dealing with foreign fighters. Most parents don't want their kids to go off to Syria and Iraq to be fodder for ISIL. They desperately want to find ways to convince their kids, if they get any knowledge that that's what they're thinking, not to do it. Working with parents, with communities, helping to educate, giving them tools, that can be effective. The internet, obviously, has been a profoundly powerful tool for extremists to attract recruits. And this is a challenge that we are deeply engaged in. And Rick Stengel, who runs the effort at the State Department, has been doing tremendous work there. But here it's interesting. For obvious reasons, we're often not the best messenger. And so getting other countries to step up, but not just countries, identifying the right individuals who actually have the ability to reach people, that's critically important, and we're working on that. And then finally, two other things, this notion, and this is a much longer term effort, how do you convince people in France or Germany or Denmark or pick your place, or the United States, that they really do have a stake in a future in their societies and that they don't become as susceptible as they are to some of these extremist narratives? That's a much longer term project. One other element that's interesting to me, Prisons. 2 of the 3 Charlie Hebdo attackers were radicalized in prison. They were sort of petty criminals, didn't have much of a future, went to prison, they became ideological. That's something we also need to get a grip on. So finally, to come to your question about the so-called Islamic label, I think it's a profound mistake to put that label on what we're seeing for 2 reasons. First of all, it's exactly what the extremists want. They want to be legitimized by an association with religion. We would be playing into their narrative. Second, and by the way, I think Fareed Zakaria pointed this out in a piece the other day, which was interesting. You know, there are 1.6 billion Muslims, give or take, around the world. There's somewhere between 20 and 30,000 adherents to ISIL, and then some other extremists. So we would be allowing 0.00019% of a particular religious group to define the entire group. That makes no sense. And beyond that, the second reason is it actually has the potential to alienate the people that you need on the front lines combating this problem. And that's exactly what we heard from most, if not all, at least what I heard, of the ministers and other delegates from the countries who were in town last week.
Kareem, and maybe you can grab David Enzor's mic or somebody. Greg, you're coming next, so you can keep the mic on.
Thanks, Tony. This has been very interesting. Last week, Stefan de Mistura was in town. He's the UN Special Envoy for Syria. I believe you met with him as well. He said in a private briefing that Iran has been supporting Syria, the Assad regime, to the tune of $35 billion annually, which is an astonishing figure. It's almost 10% of Iran's GDP. I'm wondering if you can comment on that. And I'm wondering if you can also comment about, has there been any evolution in Iran's regional policies since Hassan Rouhani's election? We've seen an increased flexibility from Iran and a willingness to engage the United States on the nuclear issue. But over the last year and a half, have you seen any difference in the regional policies? Thank you.
Thanks. Second question first. I haven't seen any difference. If anything, I've seen Iran trying to take advantage of different openings, for example, in Yemen. And we've seen a continuation of destabilizing activities, support for terrorist groups. I think there's been, you could make the case that for reasons of their own, they've done some positive things in Iraq, not in any coordination or cooperation with us, because it advanced their interests. But that's their own agenda. I think it's a reflection of the fact that, first, what we're doing with Iran on the nuclear file is entirely segregated from everything else. It's been walled off. And the people who are responsible for trying to pursue the agreement on behalf of Iran are not the same people who are really in charge of their policy in other areas. And so there seems to be a little bit of a dichotomy between the way they're approaching the nuclear issue, which has been, I would say largely pragmatic, which doesn't mean we will get to an agreement, versus their activities in other areas, which I think have continued and arguably accelerated in some ways. Second, with regard to the support for Syria, I can't vouch for the number that Stefan provided, but there's no doubt that Iran is spending a very significant amount of resources to prop up the Assad regime. And these are resources that arguably it really can't afford, which hopefully may be one incentive for Iran to think about putting its weight and influence behind some kind of negotiated political transition. And by the way, the same goes for Russia. They're also expending significant resources to support Assad, resources that they also don't really have the luxury of spending in that way. And one would hope that they will think twice going forward, that it might be to their benefit to not have to make those same kind of expenditures and to help move in the direction of a political transition that allows Syria to remain intact, its institutions intact, but takes the magnet for extremism, which is bad for Russia and bad for Iran in terms of ISIL, away, and that's Assad.
Good, Craig.
Mr. Secretary, my question is about linkage and to what extent you and your colleagues have been thinking about that. You spoke today very eloquently, and many of the leaders of the administration have already spoken also about the impact of our sanctions and European sanctions on Russia and what kind of an adverse effect they've had. To what extent, on a measurement from 0 to 10, is there concern in the administration that there may be linkage that results from that? Particularly the following question: to what extent are we relying upon Russian cooperation for a successful result with Iran?
So Greg, I think it's a really interesting question, and one that we've been looking at. And here's what I can tell you just in terms of sort of practical observation. What's been really interesting is that, again, because it's, I think, a matter of self-interest, when it comes to the Iran nuclear negotiations, the Russians have been a constructive partner, and they've remained a constructive partner. They have tried to advance constructive ideas in the course of these negotiations. And so the profound difference that we have with them over Ukraine has not bled into the Iran nuclear negotiations. I would say similarly, although it's less acute because not much is happening on North Korea, that has not been especially problematic either. So I think what one can take from that is, in part, that where Russia concludes that a particular issue and cooperation in the context of that issue advances its own interests, it's going to keep doing it, irrespective of what's going on with Ukraine or anything else. At least that's been the case to date. I think one of the many frustrations about the actions that Russia chose to take in Ukraine is that we had built over some years better cooperation with Russia on a number of fronts that were obviously beneficial to our own security and interests, and presumably beneficial to theirs. Whether it was New START, whether it was Iran, whether it was Afghanistan, where Russian cooperation has been important in allowing us to move people and material in and out, that was all good. And we were, ironically, Russia's probably its biggest champion for getting into the WTO, as you remember. But that, of course, is no longer where we are in the relationship. But the bottom line is, where its self-interest is clearly at stake and cooperation advances that self-interest, it continues.
Margaret Warner,
Mr. Deputy Secretary.
you want to get your microphone if you don't mind, Margaret?
Thank you. So, one, how do you assess Putin's intentions toward the 3 Baltic states? Is NATO absolutely committed to defending them? And does NATO have the military capability to do so, whether it would be a conventional kind of aggression, or, as we've seen them do in Crimea and in the eastern provinces of Ukraine, this sort of new kind of surreptitious invasion from within?
The answer to your second question, is NATO committed to the defense of its members in the Baltic states? The answer is yes, period. With regard to the third part of the question, do we have the means to defend? Again, the answer is yes, and one of the things that we've been working on since this crisis erupted was to take very concrete steps, not only to reassure our partners and allies, but also to enhance the capacity to deal with these kinds of challenges. I'm confident that if it came to that, thank you, the answer is yes. The first part of the question is a lot harder, and I don't know. It's hard to read intentions. I think one thing I take from what's happened in Ukraine is that, to some extent, there's been a lot of improvising by Russia to deal with a fast-changing situation that seemed to be spinning out of its control. But I think, unfortunately, from its perspective, the improvising, as I tried to make the case earlier, has actually put it in a place where it's going to, over time, be a real strategic loss for them. But I can't put myself in that mindset. I do think that it would be a very serious mistake for anyone to doubt our commitment to, and the commitment of other allies to, our NATO commitments.
But what would that kind of defensive action look like if they use, say, in Latvia, the kind of MO they used in Crimea?
I'm not going to speculate on what might happen in the future in hypothetical situations. I can tell you that countries are very seized with with concerns of those kinds of actions in the future, and I think they're looking very hard and acting on how they can better position themselves should something like that happen. But it's hard to really speculate about something like that.
Professor Gotti?
Thank you, and thanks for this very comprehensive statement today. I'd like to ask a semi-academic question back on Ukraine, as you would expect me to do. The perennial gap, my question has to do with the perennial gap between words and deeds in our foreign policy, specifically on Ukraine. It appears to me that when we talk about its independence and sovereignty, when we talk about, I think you mentioned maybe not that word, the sanctity of its borders, are we not promising more than what our allies in the Atlantic Alliance are prepared to deliver?
Charles, I think to date at least, one of the great strengths, if not the greatest strength, of the approach that we've taken to Ukraine is that we've sustained the solidarity among our partners and allies. And we've managed to do virtually everything jointly and in lockstep. And there's been criticism at various points along the way that we should have gone further and faster, for example, at various points on sanctions. And the presidents believe very strongly that we're actually much more effective if we can sustain that kind of joint action and solidarity, particularly when it comes to exerting pressure. And so what we've seen, at least up until now, is rather extraordinary unity of purpose with the major European partners on Ukraine. And it's not easy, as you know better than anyone. There are tremendous pressures that governments are under to take different directions on this. But thanks in no small measure, at least in my judgment, first and foremost to the President's leadership, because I witnessed this firsthand, and it's stuff that doesn't get seen on a daily basis. But the constant calls and meetings, and led by him throughout, have made a huge difference in keeping people on the same page. And then, of course, folks working for the President or the Secretary engaging on this, that's made a huge difference. But we've also seen extraordinary leadership from our partners, starting with Angela Merkel and Prime Minister Cameron, President Hollande, and others. So we've put a premium on trying to sustain that cooperation and coordination and unity, again, because we think that's how we're more effective. And conversely, if we allowed Putin to divide us, that would be a strategic success for him that we don't want and can ill afford. But this is, as we've started out at the beginning by saying, this is it's a very challenging situation. You have a country that is right there on Ukraine's border with significant resources in terms of its military and proxies that it is supplying and supporting, promoting. And the idea that this can be reversed militarily, I think, is probably unlikely, which is why a more asymmetric response, primarily through exerting pressure, I believe over time is going to produce the results that we're looking for. But to do that, we need to keep the unity that we have with the Europeans.
Mark Landler?
Thank you. Tony, a slightly more personal question, if I may. You spent 6 years working in a White House and in an NSC that gained a reputation for being extremely covetous of the most sensitive, foreign policy files, was accused from time to time of micromanaging, and there was clear frustration in the agencies on the part of many people who felt that they just didn't have enough leeway. You've now gone to one of those agencies, so I'm wondering what life is like at the other end of that telescope.
On my second day at the State Department, we had a large staff meeting, and I said that I had come to one conclusion after 48 hours at State, and that is that micromanagement from the White House has to stop. I think this, look, my own experience, Mark, and different people see this different ways, having worked in the Clinton administration and having at least been a witness to the Bush administration from Congress. my sense is that this is the same story with different degrees maybe in virtually every administration. And there are inherent institutional challenges that are built into the system between the White House and the State Department or the Pentagon, or you pick your agency. And sometimes it's a function of, in terms of how far up the dial you're going with the individuals. Maybe it's a function of the issues that are in play. But it seems to me that this is something that's just baked in and built in. I like to think that when I was still at the White House working on the interagency process as the Deputy National Security Advisor, that in fact we ran a very inclusive process where all of the agencies and departments were at the table, had their say, and indeed drove policy in most areas. That was the way it was supposed to work, and that's the way, at least in my small part, I tried to make it work. So, again, I think some of the frustrations and concerns that get expressed just seem to me to be the natural product of the institutional relationship that exists in any administration.
I've been given the signal that there's only one more question, and there are two people who've been on the list for a while. So I'm going to ask both of you to ask a question together. And Secretary Blinken can use it as a springboard for his closing statement. That's David Ensor and Doyle McManus. I know there are many others, but they've had their hands up for a while.
Mr. Deputy Secretary, I'm just wondering, we had a Minsk agreement the other day, and then Debaltseve fell almost immediately, and I don't think it was ever not under fire. Did you know that's what was going to happen? Was that what you expected? Are there any red lines in Ukraine as far as the administration is concerned?
And Doyle, why don't you ask one as well, and that way we can give Secretary Blinken a platform.
All right, this is a 40,000-foot question, but I hope you'll take it as a welcome invitation to go back to where you started the session, Tony, and that was your vigorous rebuttal of critics who worry that the administration isn't doing enough leadership. Some of that criticism is obviously partisan, but not all of it is. Some of it, there are plenty of possible explanations for why that concern arises in so many quarters. You've had a bad patch of conflicts with a bad correlation of forces. We're still conditioned by the Cold War to expect instant results. So take yourself to the 40,000-foot level and write us the history of this administration's transformation of American leadership.
Perfect ender for Secretary Blinken. But first, David's question on Ukraine.
What?
What was that question?
Yeah, actually, I think David's question's easier now.
Write the history of this administration.
Look, Debaltseve was a land grab, and it was done after. It was in train before the Minsk implementation agreement was signed, and it was pretty far along. But then the ceasefire was supposed to take effect on Sunday. It didn't, and the separatists grabbed what they could of Debaltseve, aided and abetted by Russia. In my judgment, that needs to be accounted for going forward. I think it's clear also going forward that the ceasefire needs to be fully implemented. The heavy weapons need to be pulled back. And I think you heard the Secretary say, I can't remember if it's today or yesterday, probably yesterday at this point, he's in Europe, that absent those initial steps being taken, we are going to have to deepen and extend the pressure on Russia. And we're talking very closely to our European partners right now about next steps. If these two very basic things, ceasefire, pullback of the heavy weapons, which were the initial steps agreed to by Russia in the Minsk implementation agreement, don't take place. That's what we're looking for, and we're looking for that in the coming days. And if it doesn't happen, we will take account of that. On the 40,000-foot question, boy, that would take a while to try to answer with any kind of adequacy. I guess I would say this. Look, you can look at the specifics of how the administration has handled different challenges, worked on different opportunities. You can look at the sort of big-muscled movements of trying to bring to conclusion two large wars. You can look at the big-muscled movements now of these trade agreements, which, were they to happen, TPP and then ultimately TTIP, would cover about 70 to 75% of global GDP. That would be hugely significant. You can look at the big muscle movement of climate change and whether we get a significant step forward in Paris at the end of the year. But I guess if I had to step back, I think what we've tried to do is to look at a few basically guiding principles that we've tried to put in place. And we obviously are not perfect in adhering to them. No one is. One is we tried to act with a sense of general purpose, and it's actually a purpose that's probably extended from the beginning of the Republic, and that is to look out for the security of our citizens, to try and advance their economic prosperity, to try and promote our values, and maybe one added element, which is to try and strengthen some of the institutions of international order. So we've worked to do that. We have tried to act and lead from a position of strength, and that started with trying to get our economic house in order, because I think we believe that we're much stronger abroad when we have a strong economic foundation at home, and I think we're in a much better position now than we've been. Parenthetically, when I was in China last week, I had been there previously with Vice President Biden in the depths of our economic crisis, and that was a point, I think Jim will remember this, when the Chinese loved to talk about, needle us and say, oh, maybe we shouldn't keep our money in the United States, it's so risky, to which the Vice President responded, go ahead, take it out. And of course they didn't, because even in the depths of our crisis, it remained the best place, the safest place. But the Vice President said then, and I remember it very well, to the Chinese leadership, it's never a good bet to bet against the United States. And I think, at least right now where we are, and I happily reminded our hosts of this, he was right. So we've tried to lead from a position of strength, but not only with a strong economy, but also with what remains and what will remain the strongest military by far in the world, despite sequestration. That doesn't make things any easier, but we have made the smart investments in that. Third, we've tried, as a general principle, to actually live and lead from our values, doing that at home to the extent possible. So, bringing health care to 30 million more Americans, that's a value that resonates around the world, and I've heard it traveling around the world. But also on everything from working hard to close Guantanamo, to ending torture, to other steps we've taken to demonstrate that we're serious about living our values. We've tried to lead from the proposition that doing so with partners is the smarter and more effective way to advance our interests around the world. And so we spent a lot of time working on building partner capacity, working on cooperating with established partners, building the capacity of new ones. And that has very positive moments and then also frustrations. It's a long-term process. But we're infinitely better off doing it with partners where we can. We've also, as a fifth principle, I would say, tried to make the case that we needed to use all of the elements of our national power and not over-rely on one muscle. And so the military element has remained critical, our economic strength has remained critical, but we've also sought to energize our diplomacy, to advance development, to tackle some of these large underlying issues. And I think one of the hallmarks is going to be, and people debate this and dispute this, but the President believes strongly that it really doesn't make a great deal of sense to bog down tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of Americans in foreign lands for decades at a time when there may be other means of dealing with the security threats that those places represent. So I think that's been something that was. And then finally, I would say we're trying to lead with a sense of perspective. And here's what I mean by that. The fact of the matter is, this is a period of extraordinary change around the world with big fault lines that are moving. Some good, some bad, and some indifferent. It's what you make of it. And we see all of those fault lines very acutely in the Middle East in particular, where you have changing relationships among states and within states, between the old order and new aspirants, empowered individuals, conflicts that may be ethnic or religious in nature with a lid coming off, new technology that is bringing people together but also creating greater vulnerabilities. And I think what's important, at least for me, that I take away from this is that a lot of this is not about us. And we have to have some humility in thinking that we are either the cause of every problem or the solution, because so much of this has nothing to do with us. But the problem is, it affects us. And so if we don't deal with it to the best of our ability, it will bite us even harder. And beyond that, even if it's not about us, and even if we can't fix everything, more than any other country on earth, we have an ability, at least on the margins, to shape change, to mitigate some of its challenges and downsides, and hopefully to maximize some of its opportunities. So that, broadly speaking, is the perspective we've tried to bring to bear on these problems. That's very much how the President, I think, and the Secretary would see them. And, you can run down the checklist of where it's worked, where it hasn't worked, where it's still a work in progress. But the main thing I would leave you with is exactly what I started with. The notion that the United States is somehow not leading, that we're not more engaged in more places than ever before, is belied by the simple thought experiment. Take us out of the picture. What do all of these things look like? And I can tell you they look a heck of a lot worse. Thanks.
I want to thank Michelle Smith and the Robert Smith Foundation for sponsoring these. I want to pay my respects to Lois Rice, a scholar from the Brookings Institution, who's been a friend of the Aspen Institute for many years. And I especially want to thank Deputy Secretary Antony Blinken.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for what you do.